all of us.
No, just now, I'm good with it.
So we have 9 people here in New York, and we have Patricia online,
Oh.
and maybe we'll get Patricia Castro,
Patricia,
and maybe we'll have a few more people come in online.
Barbara,
Patricia, where are you?
Beverly.
I'm in São Paulo, Brazil.
Oh, wow,
Brazil.
in Brazil.
Yes.
Oh, my God.
I'm in New York now. A bit in New York.
All right, so I'll do,
Patricia from Brazil.
here's Patricia, and here's everybody. We have Barbara,
Hi, Patricia.
Teresa, Gracie, Joel, Marion Lewis, Kevin, Juan,
Hello.
Tracy,
Great to have you.
and me.
See her.
Sure.
Okay, okay.
Okay, thanks for being here at this blessed hour where we are privileged to talk about the Pathwork lectures and privileged to be able to apply this to our lives and learn lessons, learn deep lessons to help us create more pleasure in our lives and more meaning. This lecture, it's called Reaching the Spiritual Center, Struggle Between the Lower Self and the Superimposed Conscience.
I'd like to say a little prayer before.
Of course, yes, let's say a prayer one, of course. Please.
Just to kind of like prepare the environment. Heavenly Father, we gather here today in this beautiful hour, all of us here as one soul, eager to know your word, eager to know your guidance. We ask the Spirit Guide, we ask Jesus Christ, all guardian angels to really be with us in this hour and really help us open our hearts and minds to be receptive to the teachings that we are about to receive, and also to give us the strength, the courage, the enthusiasm, and the wisdom to put it into practice in our everyday lives so that we can really become a beautiful vessel that we were meant to be in this world, vessel of love, peace, and joy to all those who cross our paths. Amen.
Amen.
How you got one of these?
I don't.
Mr. Collins, man.
Thank you very much, Juan. What you said, Juan,
Yes.
kind of reminds me of the part of the lecture where he says that the spiritual selves of all people are the same,
Yeah, that's exactly what.
right? That's exactly what I was kind of taking off on when you said that, you know, that when you get to the core of your spiritual center, it's the same as everyone else's spiritual center. So there's no separation, division between us.
Page 3.
That's on page 3?
Yeah, page 3, because I was in question.
Ah, question. Yeah, check this out. Check this out. Since your inner spiritual self is the same as everyone's spiritual self, the separateness is lifted the moment you are no longer separate from your spiritual center. The real you is the other person's real self. There is no barrier between them. The barrier lies only in the covering layers. So, I mean, this is very similar to the guy talking about how the higher selves of two people can never be in conflict, right? I mean, what is true for your higher self has to be true for the other person's higher self in any situation. That's the way it is. And, you know, I keep thinking about Gandhi in that context, you know, that Gandhi obviously wanted to throw off the oppression of the British, but the British also wanted that, but they just didn't know it. You know, so in other words, the higher selves of the British, even though they were colonialists, was the same as Gandhi, and they worked together to create a better reality. So I do think about that, you know, that it seems like everyone is opposing everyone else, competition, but in truth, well, we see that all the time. Like in a work situation, let's see, where two people apparently have a conflict, and then all of a sudden they're able to work together and they find that they both want the same thing, right? But what the guide says here You know, I mean, that's pretty radical. You know, the real you is the other person's real self. And of course, that doesn't mean that every one of ourselves is not unique, because I believe that everyone is unique, but at the same time, we are unified at the core, what the guide calls the inner spiritual center. Okay. So this lecture, struggle between the lower self and the superimposed conscience. Now, the superimposed conscience is a really bad thing. I mean, this is very, very heavy duty. You know, the guide says on page 8, as I have said before, in this struggle, you treat yourself with merciless harshness. You inflict iron rules upon yourself as exercised by the cruelest ruler, and far beyond the unreasonable standards which may be exerted by society. So, you know, whatever difficult, impossible standards are exerted by society, our own superimposed conscious is even worse. And I was kind of thinking about that, you know, this inner tyrant that is so cruel. And how exactly does that manifest in our lives? What exactly is that? I was thinking about this science fiction story, or maybe it wasn't, more like Soviet realism. You know, the science fiction behind what used to be the Iron Curtain was really social commentary, but it was dressed up as science fiction. And there was one story in which there was a society of very cruel mechanical men, like robots, who would torture human beings. And it turns out that a human being puts himself inside one of these robots thinking that he's transgressing, but it turns out that all the mechanical people have really human beings inside. And they're all treating each other with tremendous cruelty. So does you pretend to, because you want to be invulnerable and strong, you pretend to be this mechanical thing that inflicts pain and cruelty, and you're desperate. You don't want anyone. They didn't think that these had human beings inside them, but they did. So it's kind of similar, like what kind of a harsh tyrant could this superimposed conscience be?
And here it says a lot that the model of that tends to come from your parents when you misinterpret.
Yes,
How they themselves are these hardened robots, as you would say, right? Or as you just
Yes,
gave.
exactly,
Right?
exactly.
And so therefore it's like, whoa, suddenly I'm patterning this voice in my head that's either my mother or my father. And I want to live up to that.
Oh, we just were thinking you were gonna.
Guys,
turn-
we had
We've
to
been looking for you
have some
online.
visitors. Yeah.
I
Wow.
know, that's great, welcome. And Teresa, you're.
And Teresa's here too.
Hello. Sorry, I'm working from home today, so I didn't come to the city. It's just too hot.
Hey, Teresa, we have a full house here in
Hi,
Tracy.
Alan. Yeah, I see that. I'll be there next time.
Thanks for coming.
See you.
Pull up a chair and sit on the floor.
See you tonight, face to face. Yeah.
Wow.
Susan, oh, Susan, Marion.
It's wonderful to see you.
Oh, you're so much.
It's great.
This is how.
We're getting old school here.
Here we go. Hey, I'm gonna show you guys Patricia and Teresa, who we have here.
Gotta listen to that.
Our higher selves.
What house today? Susan?
Which one? Does anybody else, I have an extra, need more, you get your purse back there, you want this instead?
And the part.
You want this? Anybody need an extra? Okay, well, it's right here, if we change the paper, I'll use it. Let it not go to waste.
All right.
Yeah.
So glad you came.
No, so happy to see you again. I was just telling her, but we were just sitting here, where is she? Where is she? Because you're always,
You right?
and then,
Last time we were all the only ones on Zoom, so I thought
I should probably.
Yeah.
So we have Teresa with us on Zoom,
Yeah,
and we have Patricia from Sao Paulo, Brazil.
yeah. Teresa,
That's
Wonderful.
not this Teresa. We have two Teresas.
All right. So hope I'm not giving anybody out there in cyberspace whiplash by turning this thing on. All right, so let's just go over the lecture. We just talked a little bit about the superimposed conscience and how cruel and how much of a tyrant it is. And I guess we're going to come back to that. But, okay, here we go. Everybody has a copy of the lecture? So, guide starts the lecture with kind of a message of hope to the people who are there. Many of us,
Beverly, you can just put it down.
Okay.
You're not gonna hurt it.
I want to kill your furniture.
No, it's okay. It's stone. Okay.
many of us feel an extension of awareness, a raising of consciousness. Where life seemed hopeless, we now see hope and security, believing that unhappiness or unfulfillment is a result of inner error and confusion. So he's saying that, the guide almost in every lecture talks about the progress that's being made or the promise that we can accept, that we can expect if we follow the pathwork and do this work of self-facing. He says, a lot of you feel that a sense that it's not such a bad world to live in after all. Okay, I can accept that. Now, the guide, of course, in the middle of page 1, he again restates what the goal of the pathwork is. Our objective is to know specifically in what respect you still feel unfree and obstructed, defensive and anxious. And then this inventory. In what respect, 1, you now understand your problems? In what respect, 2, you still feel resistant to change in spite of the understanding gained? And 3, in what respect you are still in the dark and need further insight? And in what respect, 4, you have resolved certain problems? So that's kind of a useful exercise in inventory. Recap. The goal of the pathwork is self-realization, seeking the answer inside ourselves, not outside. When we do this, we come into contact with the innermost core, the treasure of divine love, wisdom, and strength. This aim, clearly defined, means that there will, quote, no longer be a conflict between spiritual and worldly interests. Now, the guide mentions this is the final session of the year, because in those days, the pathwork would kind of take the summer off and reconvene in September. And I think that maybe it's because a number of the people in the pathwork were like college professors and people like that who had an academic year. So the pathwork the guide often talks about, well, we have a working season, which starts in September and kind of ends in June, and then people take some time off in the summer. So that's what the guide says on the bottom of page 1, which is one can't find the answer outside. One has to find the answer within. And you can't expect others to make you happy. He says that one kind of person expects others to fulfill them. Another kind of person may look for answers in philosophy, religion, science. You may indeed find many valuable and valid answers from such sources. However, they will not truly help unless you use such answers as a guiding light to start an inner search deep within yourself. So, we're always called on this intellectual path work to try to dip into our feelings and our intuition, which, that's a big task. It's easier to look at it as a philosophy rather than something that invites you to dip into it experientially. And then the guide, of course, says, all of you contain within yourself all the knowledge, all the wisdom, and all the powers that you could possibly need in order to live a satisfactory life. And now that's kind of interesting phrase, a satisfactory life, right? Not like a fantastic life, not an amazing life, a satisfactory life. And I think that that also touches on humility, because humility is the opposite of the lower self. The lower self is a climate of egocentricity, he says later on. So with humility, you say, hey, I'm not going to demand a perfect life. I can ask for a satisfactory life. Expect a satisfactory life if I engage in this path of self-facing.
I think it also has to do with the fact that in this world, nothing is completely perfect. Nothing is
Right,
total,
that's for sure.
100%. So we feel okay with satisfactory life. We can expect everything to be perfect, really. I mean, because of
Okay.
duality.
All right, so the second section starts midway down page 2. He says that there are two fundamental attitudes among human beings. The one is evolved people who want to live their lives in an ethical way, that encompassing people who want to live their lives in an ethical way. The guide kind of mentions parenthetically people who are not interested in doing that, people who don't care about other people. Now, we all care about other people, right? I think if you come into a path of self-facing, that's part of what you are. So we're not talking about people that don't care, but we're talking about two kinds of people. One, a person that searches for God, and another is somebody who wants to live well. The person who wants to live well finds God if they search hard enough, the guide says. In other words, if you really want to live well, you are led to your spiritual center. But if you search for God and search for spiritual development, then you have to follow this path of self-facing, and you have to try to dissolve the big dichotomy the guide talks about in this lecture, which also is mentioned in many others, that there doesn't have to be a contradiction between spiritual and personal fulfillment. Guide says, if you recognize the obstructions that have to be understood and dissolved so the spiritual center is reached, then a life in God will no longer be found contradictory to a life of personal fulfillment. So that's a big statement. And the question, of course, is what exactly do we mean by personal fulfillment? But the guide does say, that pleasure here and now in the body is not incompatible with spirituality. And obviously, everybody knows who studied the history of the Catholic Church that those two things were, separate. You were supposed to mortify the flesh to attain spiritual knowledge. But the guide says you don't have to do that. All right. So again, the guide emphasizes that it's a misconception to believe that the spiritual life means sacrificing personal fulfillment. Quote, a deep understanding and complete awareness of your problems, your lower self, that is, will indicate that the inner core of your spiritual self is no longer hidden and out of reach. So unhappiness, we can define it as the lack of contact with the spiritual center. All right. So page 3. Which we mentioned earlier on at the beginning of our discussion tonight. Since your inner spiritual self is the same as everyone else's spiritual self, the separateness is lifted if you are in touch with your spiritual center. The real you is the other person's real self. There is no barrier between them. The barrier lies only in the covering layers. And the guide says that the way to feel the reality of the spiritual center is to remove all that stands in the way. which is personal misconceptions and confusions, erroneous conclusions, ignorance and misunderstanding. So, as he says, quote, your personal attitudes, outlooks, and concepts must be questioned, stated, and restated. So it's a path of observation. Oh,
Can you say that again?
I can, yes. Oh, we're joined, I think. He says, your personal attitudes, outlooks, and concepts must be questioned, stated, and restated. So that's, again, the path of observation and self-facing. And I have to emphasize, as I've done several times, that writing down your impressions of yourself, your observations, is very important. And that is why I resist doing it so much. Because I think that we get into the question of how to write down these observations. It can very easily be self-punishing. Like my father, I have his journals now. And there's a real self-punishing quality about his journals, about like how he still hasn't gotten over his mother, how he still punishes himself, he still is envious, he's still angry, all this stuff that he keeps dredging up without a lot of joy, which is something that I think it's a tragedy to ignore the joy and not let the joy. So the observation, there has to be a kind of lightheartedness about it, I think. Right, Kevin? There has to be a lightheartedness. There has to be an acknowledgement, but not a self-punishing. Well, my dad was Catholic, so he had the kind of guilt going on. Maybe that's the reason. Anyway. All right, so now the main topic is broached on page 4, which is the fight between what we have called the lower self and the superimposed conscience. Okay. This all-important topic. Now, if we go back to the higher self, lower self, and mask lecture, which I think is number 14, the guide defines the lower self as follows, quote, the lower self consists not only of the common faults and the individual weaknesses that vary within each person, but also of ignorance and laziness. It hates to change and conquer itself. It has a very strong will that may not always manifest itself outside and wants its way without paying the price. It is very proud and selfish and always has a great deal of personal vanity. It is the ego with all of its manifestations. That's what the guide says about the lower self is in that very early lecture. Now, in this lecture, the guide
Something,
kind of updates it a little bit.
yeah.
Says, quote, the best way to describe it is an emotional climate of
Yeah.
egocentricity.
Yeah.
And good intentions mask it. One is ashamed of this one-sided egocentricity and hides it in guilt and shame. So I really think that's a very valuable way to look at this, because I think that it's easy to recognize egocentricity in ourselves and others. You kind of know it when you've got it, when you're functioning in that way. And that's why earlier on I mentioned humility as sort of an antidote. Like, I'm not that special. You know, my life can be satisfactory. I don't have to have a life that shouts to high heaven how great everything is or how great I am. Egocentricity. So he says, you must become acutely aware of its often preposterous self-concern to the exclusion of all else. It is the area of your being where you wish to rule supreme. And meaningfully, he says, continues, you do not want to know another's interests, which you violate at any cost, so that a small wish or gratification of your vanity overrules more important issues for other people. So in other words, the lower self is ready, willing, and able to ride roughshod over somebody else's concerns. Doesn't care much. And then, of course, the guide says, which is interesting and, redolent of many other lectures, quote, the problem is really not, it's less the existence of the lower self than our attitude toward it, which is that we should already have overcome it and that we should be beyond it. Now, we deceive ourselves that it does not exist. So, namely, C.S. Lewis famously said that the devil's greatest trick is convincing people that he doesn't exist. Convincing people that he doesn't exist.
We don't have that problem.
Right. We don't have that
He's
problem.
very present.
The devil is rooting and tooting. He's doing his thing. He's out there.
He's taking.
You can find any one of he's all over the place.
Very popular.
Very popular. It's that tie. It's a long tie. But seriously, folks, I mean, so it's that we have to recognize it does exist. And I think the way the guy talks about the lower self is that it's something that kind of sneaks out and quickly gets repressed. I mean, for people like us, I might say. In other words, we don't like the idea that we do have a lower self, that we still have one. So I think we try to cover it up, deny it, and we try to pretend it doesn't exist. That's what the guide says. So the guide cautions us to watch for the manifestations of the lower self, watch how we deny it, how we deny the recognition that we do have a lower self. Okay. Now the next section, page 6. Now the guy talks about the superimposed conscience, the other big concept of the lecture. Now, first he says that there's an inner conscience, and then there's the superimposed conscience. We all know the inner conscience. That's what's commonly understood by the conscience, which is the little voice that tells us not to do something that we know we're not being straight up and honest, like, Jiminy Cricket, or the little angel in the cartoon that's saying, don't do that, don't eat that ice cream, or whatever it is. And the devil's saying one thing. So we know what the conscience is, the conscience that kind of brings us back to ourselves. It's a little voice that it's defined, definitive. That little voice, we hear it. We can disregard it, but we know what our conscience is. We know when we're feeling our conscience. Now, the superimposed conscience is very different. That, the guide says, comes from our interactions with our parents and also from our interactions with society. He says, first of all, it hides the lower self. And because it hides the lower self, it prevents the lower self from being transformed. It also hides the most creative life force and impulses that serve that life force. It is, quote, an unnecessary artificial creation instilling an unrealistically distorted view of oneself, as well as of the way one believes one would have to be. So it creates self-punishment and imposes shackles, which prohibit the manifestation of divine qualities. And interestingly enough, he says, it never prevents crime or destructive actions. So it traps the self. It's also, he says, behind the rebellion against all standards of ethics and morals. He says, last paragraph, page 6, it induces you to reject yourself as a human being. So in that, it's like a totalitarian government or authority. In that, it's repressive of humanity, like 1984, like Stalin, like any dictatorship. However, we cling to it, he says, because we believe that, quote, it alone can prevent you from acting upon your lower self instincts. So rather than exposing the lower self and transforming it, we kind of give authority to the superimposed conscience. But he says, as long as one has not found the real self, one must cling to the superimposed conscience, obeying, conforming, appeasing, and blindly following it. In the superimposed conscience, we act out of bondage and fear. And if you rebel against it, interestingly enough, you are no more free than if you obey it. So, the guide says, the pleasant or unpleasant result is not as vital as you may believe it to be, because in either alternative, you have equal possibility for growth if your actions and decisions are derived from yourself and your own standards. So that bears some discussion about the result. And that, I think, has to do with humility again and the ego again, what the result has to be, what you believe the result must be. Let me do that again. That's complicated. So anyway, we're talking about, again, the fight between the superimposed conscience and the lower self, which is the primitive, self-centered, destructive child. All right. Now let's talk about this, the pleasant or unpleasant result. That's on middle of page 7. All right. Yeah, let's talk about this. If you haven't found the real self, he says, one must cling to the superimposed conscience, obeying, conforming, appeasing, and blindly following it. So the question is, what action will you take in a given situation? Will it be the action that's dictated by the superimposed conscience, or will it come from the real self? Is it following the superimposed conscience? Or is it following the voice of your real conscience in the spirit of freedom, derived out of your own inner struggle?
There's that word again, by the way. Freedom.
Freedom.
So I just want to mention that quickly.
Yeah.
There's so many times in this lecture where it references freedom as the way to see the energy of the true real self and not of the superimposed conscience. Because the superimposed conscience brings an energy of bondage, not of freedom. And that's at least for me, it's like a very clear statement. You can immediately see, oh, I'm stuck. I'm just stuck right now. And I thought I was doing the right thing. Well, then you're not doing the right thing. There's an energetic difference there when you're just stuck. So freedom, that's all. And you read that lecture again, freedom. That's all that keeps coming out to me. So
It's funny because I think it's the other way around. When you get to that core, then you experience freedom.
exactly.
But it also will give you a hint if you're not at the core, where if you feel the bondage,
Right.
then you know, okay, I'm not
That's right.
acting.
Yeah.
And the action of the superimposed conscious may be exactly the same action of the true conscious.
Yes, the action is no different.
Right,
It's this, yeah.
so
the energy
you may
of
end
the
up
action.
doing the same thing on the
Right.
outside,
Yeah.
but it's where it comes from is
Exactly.
different.
Exactly.
Right, that's what the guide says in that
It's what
passage.
informs the action that's very different.
Right.
But the action could be
So
the
nobody
same.
on the outside would
You
even
can
know.
pretend
like,
to be
you know,
good. Or to feel uncomfortable.
Intention is everything.
Intention.
Yeah.
Exactly.
All right. So, the end of page 7, guide recaps that the childhood hurts create the superimposed conscience. So you have to look at the relationship you had with your parents and the resultant images and so forth. All right. Now, the final section, what I call the final section, page 8. This recaps what we said earlier about the superimposed conscience causes us to treat ourselves with merciless harshness. Its blind, excessive standards make it impossible to reach the inner center. So here the guide talks about, again, the misconception that fulfillment in one area is bought at the expense of unfulfillment somewhere else. You know, like you can't have fulfillment in all areas of your life. You've got to give something up, but that's not true. The guide says, quote, there is room for all kinds of fulfillment in the healthy soul of a person who truly reaches into the depth of his or her being, opening up all the channels which have been clogged up before. But we don't want to believe that's possible, right? Because here we are, stuck on planet Earth. Finally, he says, accept the primitive, selfish, destructive child in order to make it grow up. So that's the end of the lecture. And then there's questions and answers. In the questions and answers, the guide talks about the familiar theme that if a man opens himself up to his femininity, he becomes more masculine. And if a woman opens herself up to her masculinity, she becomes more womanly, more feminine. And we've had that in many other lectures too. Somebody asks about promiscuity. He says, question. Thinking about the sex angle, when people are unmarried and unattached and are seeking a happy relationship, how much promiscuity do you advocate? Like, come on. Answer. I do not advocate promiscuity at all. Guide says, what do you mean by promiscuity? Question. You speak of the sex instinct as natural and right, but how far do you go? Answer. The only answer, my dear friend, that I can possibly give you, if people do what they feel within their deep inner self, uninfluenced by the superimposed conscience as being right for them, well, then it is right. And then he says the next paragraph, in other words, I guess he's trying to say, look, if you feel you should do something, go ahead and do it. He says, the world would be a very different place if more people were to do whatever they do wholeheartedly, be it a human relationship, be it reading a book or taking a walk or going through a conversation. The planet is such an unhappy place because people are torn. They do not do one thing without being divided in attention and motivation. There's rarely a full commitment in anything people do. They serve 2, 3, or 10 masters at the same time, but not their own real self. People want to have everything cut out to perfection, insisting on a guarantee against all mistakes, knowing perfectly well that this cannot be.
This was before iPhones.
This is before iPhones, right? Now we have
Doesn't that
20
reflect
different
the
things.
entire lecture, that statement. I mean,
I think so. What do you,
it does,
how would
because
you?
It's not talking only about sex.
No.
The guy completely just takes this question about sex and completely makes it about everything your heart might desire. And maybe you should just listen to your heart sometimes instead of superimposing
Rules and
the
regulations.
rules and regulations that you feel as though this self-judgment would prevent you from in an automated way. That's what he's basically saying. It's don't impose the authority without thinking and considering what your heart really wants.
Right, in other
And it
words,
doesn't mean you have to act. It just means that you should at least consider like what your heart really wants and why it wants that maybe, you know?
in other words, it's the difference between the two consciences.
Yes, and not judge your heart's desire. just
Don't
be
judge your
calm,
heart's desire, but
just
be
based
receptive to your
upon- Yeah,
conscience
Right.
and not the superimposed conscience. So,
right.
I mean, how do people feel about this evil, so to speak, tyrannical, cruel, superimposed conscience? Do people see that as operating in their lives?
Love them.
Who feels
Love
that?
it.
Who feels that?
Love it. I feel it a lot, but I love it. That's all I would go back to. Don't judge it, love it.
I wanted to comment on something you said very rapidly before going into that
Yeah.
about following the heart. Because we are here to balance the head and the heart, with the heart leading the way. That is intuition and that is God. So therefore, this heart is not this frivolous thing or this, it's the new brain. Scientists are fighting it. It's the new brain. So to balance the head and the heart with the heart leading the way, I just want to back up what you were
So
saying
true.
before we went on, because that is so important, because they're even finding, scientists are finding some cells within the heart that are very similar to brain cells, but they aren't brain cells. They are heart cells, but they're similar to the brain cells. So for a society to make this change, it will happen, but it's not an emotional. It's just such a grounded scientific
Hmm. Yeah.
balance, you know. So I just wanted to say
Very
that
true,
before we
very
went.
true.
I think Dr. Joe Dispenza talks about that,
What?
Greg
Yeah.
Braden.
With-
Oh, Joe Dispenza and Greg Braden talks a lot about that. Yes, yeah, and they go very much in depth about it. Like if you listen to their lectures, they really go deep into it. So,
Very true.
so yeah, for the longest time, we've lived in a society where we've been taught that if you follow your heart, you know, it's going to lead you astray, and we should only be in our logic driven mind, you know, like
Yes,
be more in
there's
the
still a
mind.
misconception about the heart, that it's emotional. And
Yes.
it's not about emotions, so it's discovering a new kind of consciousness within that.
Yeah.
It'll take some time for all humanity to do that, but
It's trusting in yourself, really, in a very basic way. It's just trusting that you have the answers within,
then
like
you have to
the
see it.
beginning of this lecture even
you have to
mentions.
to back it up.
Yeah, of course, right. It's not only hard and just let me just be,
It's a balance.
yeah, Dionysus or something, go crazy. But yeah.
Okay, I just wanted.
that's
Thank you.
great.
I agree with Kevin, but I also wanted to see, like in me, how it represents.
Lisa.
When I talk about this imposed thing, I feel my mother. I see my mother. She was a very powerful influence in my life. She was the my way or the highway. She knew everything was supposedly good for me, and she was completely wrong. But she, but she imposed it in such a powerful way that I absorbed it. And it became like an internal voice, like I should be doing this, and I should be doing that, and I should be looking like this, and I should be looking like that. And those standards that were her standards became that voice that I judge myself against very harshly, like what the guide is saying. And now I'm learning to basically look at this and say, who's this? Whose standard is that? Do I really believe in this? And then like drop into my heart and say, what would my inner self think about that? What would my inner self respond to this? And I give you like an example, which really it's such a crazy thing between those two, and also between, I guess, the anger that I have, because my mother was so my way or the highway. I developed a lot of anger against authority, all authority. And so recently at work, I had a situation where I'm coming to a meeting, which is my meeting. I'm supposed to lead it. And somebody else kind of sort of took over because I was late. And this is somebody I like, and work with very closely. But without thinking, I just took charge, ran with the meeting. I didn't realize that I was interrupting her. And right after the meeting, she texts me and she says, I was really hurt by the way you interrupted me. And I was like, oh my God, the first thing was denial. Like, I didn't interrupt anything. This is my meeting. I came with an agenda. I wanted to manage it. And then I was like, wait a minute, what really happened? And I went back to the recording, which I record every meeting. And I said, yeah, I came late. She was talking about something. And I did just step in. I said, oh, thank you, Jen. Sorry. Let's go to this now, and introduced my agenda. And at first I was like, how could that hurt her? I'm here to conduct my meeting. Then I realized I did that. My ego stepped in. I was like, oh, somebody's running my meeting, let me just step in and take charge. So I guess my lower self showed up. But when she said that, at first I was in denial, I was deeply hurt. And just today I woke up and I'm like, oh my God, I owe her a real apology. I hurt her feelings. She was conducting business in my absence. I should have just called in and listened, stand back and listened and really see if even it's helpful for me to take over. And this is not what I did. I came and I immediately wanted to seize the charge and appear I'm in charge of this meeting. And of course, my ego is in charge and probably my lower self. I have to drive it through. And I think because of Pathwork, I realized two things. The hurt I was like really deeply hurt by it. It's actually a sign that I'm lying to myself, that my motives were not as pure as I thought they were, because I wanted to, feel in charge, feel good about myself and drive it through with my ego. And second, that Pathwork is working because that humility that came, it's like, I really hurt her. I owe her an apology. Just because we are friendly, it doesn't mean that I step in and go over her. And the humility woke up. So there's a couple of things. So my whole thing is like, the first thing is when I feel like the hurt and the anger, I know I'm going against the superimposed motherly figure, like what do you call it, the super consciousness, which really is still in me. And it's kind of sort of dictating the way I should look, the way I should live, the way I should behave, and I hate it. So I rebel against it. But then why the hell am I listening to it? Like, I need to question it every time and say, well, it says who?
Well, the guide
Like,
that you rebel against it, that doesn't solve it. You don't solve
right.
it until you're able to see the lower self, which it's trying to cover up, the actual intent, the negative intent, the ignorance, the laziness, the desire to be over and better than others,
Pride.
the pride.
That's a great first step, Teresa. That's an amazing first step. I want to send you some love on that because it's wonderful to hear you speak about that and how you
Yeah, and
spoke.
I'm going to apologize to her tomorrow. Have a one-on-one, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say, listen, I'm sincerely sorry. I listened to the recording. I didn't interrupt you, and I'm very sorry. There was no need for that.
Sure.
And stuff like that. Well, she also is controlling, and she also has a lot of lower self in her, but I genuinely like her, and she's a good person. So I owe her an apology.
Teresa, let me just take it one step further. Not that you have to go there in this short time, but indeed, there's a self-love that's very important in this process. And the part of that Alan was mentioning about reading his father's journals at one point. They were very self-judgmental. And be cautious with your own apologies that they don't drift into self-judgment, because that is just pulling the lower self into another corner of illusion. Again, you're turning this disgust or this distaste for someone into a distaste for yourself. And it's not about that. It's more about just remembering that we're all human. We all, in the moment, have potential states that could obviously, right, be potentially disruptive to our unitive nature, right? They're not acknowledging that sometimes, and we fall for it. And you know what? That's why before I mentioned, what do we do with that lower self, or what do we do when we see this? We love it. That's what we go to. And I'm not saying you have to force the love. It's not about forcing the love. It's just about recognizing that there's a space where you can put the love right now, that you can actually see the worst in yourself and laugh a little bit about it, or accept it and say, yeah, I'm messed up, man. I don't know why I did that, but it's okay for now. And I'll be
Kevin, it's very valid, but here is what it is. And this guy describes it in this lecture. My lower self, that I should love, goes against that mother's voice, which is that superimposed self. And the superimposed self is hating the lower self, and the lower self is hating the superimposed self. So there is no winning there. There is no winning there, because the superimposed self is like, oh, how could you? And then the superimposed self judges lower self of everybody else, because as much as I love Jen, she's full of herself and she loves to hear herself talk. And she cuts me out and she loves to run everything and do it her way. So I hate that too. So I hate that too. So I hate her lower self. I hate my lower self through my superimposed self, because my superimposed self hates them all whenever the lower self shows up. But my lower self hates the superimposed self. So there's got to be some path to peace in there to bury the hatchet, because they both hate one another.
I
But
feel the lightheartedness though in explaining it, right, Teresa?
what?
Do you sense the humor a little bit in what you're saying?
Yeah, no, I'm laughing. I'm like, everybody
Exactly,
hates everybody.
exactly.
Where
That's
is
gap
the?
I'm talking about.
I
That
guess the higher self needs to be observing this.
it's
and
bigger,
looking
Teresa.
at it like a madhouse.
Just promise yourself that the gap of love, the gap of self-love, the gap of love for people that are messed up or that presently seem messed up to you, all of that gap expands. It does. Trust it.
Where it comes from the higher self, right? Higher self has to throw the line. Say, wait a minute, you hate each other. Everybody hates everybody. And the superimposed self judges the lower self hates and rebels against the superimposed self. Who's gonna save the day? I guess the higher self has to come in and say, hey guys, you're both crazy.
Right.
And
you know what's funny, Teresa? The
Yeah.
day is saved even without any of our egos trying to save it. So it will take care of itself. There's a surrender in God that you talk about very often. There's just many ways to talk about this surrender. It could be humor, it could be opening up to love, it could be some sort of peace.
Yeah.
But it's not confrontation to the problem, because even though awareness is partially the confrontation that this lecture talks about, to at least be aware of that, that's important. That's confronting the problem internally. But when it comes to activity, the ego loves to be all about activity. How can I solve this? What am I going to do? No, you're not going to solve this, okay? It's in God's hands, okay? It's in the higher self's hands. It's already been in the higher self's hands. That's why you're here in this position right now, is because it has been in the higher self's hands, and you're in the perfect spot right now. That's all I'm here to say right now, Teresa. And I can feel it in your energy. You know it now. Like, that's the beauty, is I feel the laughter coming from inside of you about the craziness of it. And that
I'm
opens.
just observing that madhouse, like both going at each other and like, what are you gonna do? What are you gonna do? They hate this, I hate this. And I'm right in the middle saying, wow, this is crazy, because I'm in both spots. I'm like, yeah, I hate my lower self. Why did I do that? I wanted to show off. And then, oh, I hate the superimposed self, because it tells me, oh, go apologize, you suck. Look at how you're hurting
Teresa,
people.
I've been through hatred of the lower self. It does end. That's all I want to say at some point. The hatred of the lower self does end. It does. It is not eternal. It's not who you are. You are eternal in the unitive state in God forever. And this is just a place that we're existing.
Also, the guide,
Thank you, Kevin. Very helpful.
guide stresses that what helps us feel grounded emotionally and in our feeling level is to know the territory we're in. So we have maps of the territory. Where are we in that territory of returning to God? We work out away from that. We go to the edge of the pie, and then we got to work ourselves back. And that is that the lower self, every lower self quality is a distortion of a divine quality. So if we don't get to know it, put it in its place. Don't let it take charge. Don't let it take over, but get to know it, because it's the gateway to a higher self aspect.
The guy says that in his lecture.
Exactly.
Yeah, also I note that, cause and effect comes quickly when you're on a path of self-confrontation. Because Teresa, you got the message right away when this happened, that something was, something went down that wasn't correct. And so you cause and effect, right? Very quickly, you do something and you'll get the consequence right away. Well, I think that happens when you're working on a spiritual path. There isn't a lot of separation. I think in some lecture, the guy talks about how one person may commit a crime, and then 3 years later, something happens, the karma comes at him. But that's a person that's not conscious. For us, we do something today in the morning and we'll get hit with the consequence in the evening,
If not the morning.
not the morning.
Well said.
Yeah.
So,
That's what
so true.
No.
The path of self-facing will always bring it up quicker.
Yeah,
There is no doubt about that. And many times there's a big disturbance that you'll feel doing this
Right.
work initially. And that's it's very classic to then doubt the work, but it's not. It's really not. That's actually a really good sign that you're troubled in the moment because you're sensing it now in the moment rather than later. Yeah, and it can get really disturbing at times, but yeah.
And do you ever get the feeling like you caught, because it's like, I ran through it, I was pretty happy with everything, and then she texts me, and I'm like, oh my God, I had that feeling like really being caught, like, uh-oh, this is bad. You get that feeling.
it's just part of yourself
It's about your personality.
manifesting what you needed to
It's all
know.
about your personality type. I would go back to what
Um,
Miriam normally says
uh-huh.
about personality types when you ask about being caught, because I think it depends upon your personality type. There's at least in Pathwork, there's 3 different ways to which we tend to gravitate towards our reactions to situations. Yeah. And perhaps being caught is one of those things that gives you a little insight into how your nature is when something like this unfolds, but not everybody's going to feel the same way because there's different, there's different reactions to those situations.
Okay, I'm the emotional type, so I was like, uh-oh.
I want to ask you, so does her experience of that tyrannical voice resonate with you, Tracy? I mean, when you talked about that you memorized this lecture, do you have anything to say about it? No, well, not that particular aspect perhaps, but we'll always ask you why, what you,
You always ask me why I picked the lecture, and it's always the same thing. I don't pick the lecture, it picks me. No, I mean, when I first started Pathwork, decade or more ago, I did experience that a lot, but not now. I'm pretty kind to my lower self, and I still see it and I recognize it, but I don't beat myself up about it anymore.
Mm.
And so it's
The other thing that struck me is like you were saying, how you have to love it. For me, the word compassion is more helpful because love's kind of abstract, where compassion, you're feeling into this like, oh, this is part of me. I don't want to reject it. I want to have
Exactly.
compassion for that part of me. And isn't there this concept
Yes,
of the
it's similar, because I use the word empathy.
Yeah.
Empathy is doing my
empathy,
best
yeah,
to try to put myself in somebody
That's
else's shoes. I
exactly
can't know what it's like, but I can do my best.
Yeah.
And I can, have an empathy toward that aspect of me.
And there is a concept of the objective passionate observer.
yeah.
That's a pathword.
It's sort of like the way you might feel towards your grandchild, because they're just children, they do something, because the lower stuff is very childlike, and you don't beat them up, they're just a child, they're doing something.
It's uninvested
Yeah.
in the immediate result.
Yeah.
That's what the big difference I
Yeah.
feel is.
Yeah.
If you can look at yourself and not go, what a dumbass am
Yeah.
I? Or, oh, I'm the greatest person alive, then you're not invested in the immediate result.
You're
and
just
that helps
observing
you to
You're
give
just-
the,
yeah,
you don't need the outcome
You're
to
staying
be
in your
perfect
world.
Right.
or ideal.
Yeah.
Otherwise, that superimposed self is gonna rip you apart. It's one way or the other, it's gonna tear you apart.
And everybody goes through that though, I think,
Yeah.
when they start the Pathwork, which is what makes it,
Absolutely.
because you start that process of self-computation and you're like, oh my God, I thought I was a good person.
A monster.
Oh my God.
Exactly.
No, but you know what, the cause and effect is so close now. So like, even if I'm walking down the street and I'll have a negative thought, I'll trip. So I don't have to I get the message, because a negative thought is negative. I mean, even if it doesn't matter if it's about myself or somebody else, that's not a great spot to be in.
Not helpful.
It's not, well, negative, because we now know that thoughts are creative manifesting agents. And so if you're putting negative energy out there, you're literally putting negative creative powers into the universe. And if you're going to get the karma, which you will, whether it's 3 years later or 3 seconds later, then so that's why it's, to me, like all the things I learned as a child in church now become much more, it's clear, a lot of the things that I learned you know, why they're true, you know, in more of a pathwork scientific way. It's,
Mm.
So I
Oh,
don't
Barbara, you want to say
know
something?
more about that. In other words, when I hear you say, if I have a negative thought
yeah,
and I'll trip,
yeah,
You know,
almost immediately.
so almost immediately.
Yeah.
So is is the negative thought, would you identify it like, let's say, as your lower self? Or in other words, what's the process?
Well,
When you say you don't want to put negative energy out into the
Right.
world,
yeah.
what is the process? Is that your lower self and say like, oh, think about something else? Or in other words, what happens to you in your process when you do have a negative thought?
Well, because I stay pretty much in observation of myself most of the time.
Okay.
And so I'll just say, oh, you know, I see Tracy, you just thought X, Y, Z, whatever, and now you tripped, you know, and so it's just like, I'm just almost observing myself as a third person would observe me. So I'm always, so I'm seldomly in Tracy anymore. I'm mostly in this observer of Tracy.
Yes.
That's right, yeah. That's how. I really
So I don't beat myself up. I mean, for the first 2 years I did the pathwork, I literally walked around, and Joel, I've told this, it felt like I had a knife in my gut for 2 years because
I put it there.
because I was,
Talk about the time.
because one of the first things I learned in the pathwork, the guide said to repeat this mantra, I want to know the truth about myself.
Yeah.
Okay, that's in one of the earlier lectures. And so I started doing that, you know, and this is sort of like seek and you shall find, knock and the doors will be. If you want to know the truth and you ask to know the truth, by God, you will be shown it. So I was shown it about myself. And it went on for 2 years, and it was just like, is there anything good about me? I mean, it was like, no, it's so strange because that's not really the process at first. It's like, I knew that I was, you know, generous person and kind and nice, you know, but I didn't know all the negative stuff. And I remember one day I was swimming my laps, and all of a sudden I was turning and I had a positive thought about myself, and it was, my God, there's it was 2 years into the pathwork, and it was so significant that I actually was observing something positive about myself instead of all this negativity. So I went through everything, you know, so I felt terrible about myself. But then at some point, you see, I don't feel bad. I mean, you know, it's not that it's gone. I'm not perfect. I still have negative thoughts. I still sometimes say mean things to Joel, you know, but okay, because I'm a human being. And so, but I don't beat myself up about it.
Right, that's key,
Yeah.
that's key.
Something you said is so important, is that you've activated your observer.
And I'm
Because
always in it.
The guide teaches the first step of transformation. It's not trying to be better, not trying to change anything. It's observing. Gotta name it. Oh, I noticed this, I noticed that. That's the first step. And then who is the observer? Spirit.
The
of
God,
course.
your God's not.
So it's not like I got angel, but you know, it's like,
Yeah.
so I take one step
Yeah.
away. And that's exactly what you're saying.
Yes.
Is that the first step of transformation is
And
observation.
you always
And
say that.
reporting in. And it
yeah.
brings me, all of my negative stuff brings me to God.
Yes.
Because I'm reporting into God.
Exactly.
So I being more the emotion type person and trying to be so good and submissive and all that. The other side of my dualistic coin is complaining, maligning. That's the other side of my coin, is the good girl. So when I tell my higher self, when I complain, and so I put in my to-do list every day, at least 3 complaining sessions. Because my God self is delighted when I'm activating the other side of my coin
Yeah.
of good and,
There you
you know, the good girl and the bad girl. And so, in growing up, I had to just always try to be the good girl, but my bad girl needs some expression.
Yeah.
And so I gotta report in, and it takes me to God. I thought, oh my gosh, everything's designed to take me to God.
It's appreciation.
And to listen, I have to
Right.
listen, I have to stop and listen.
One of the early things that guide also taught me was the mere observations of one's faults, one calls them
And you say pixel,
You
I
say
love that,
pixel,
I love the word pixelate really, because it's sort of like matrix,
It
right?
gets
When you
clear,
just see
yeah.
them, they're like kind of dissolving.
Yeah.
And I remember the first time I read that, I said to Joel, this is a load of shit.
Yeah.
That's what I said, I literally
Yeah.
said that, I said, nothing is gonna happen in this world unless you do something.
Yeah.
This, because I was so into act, I mean, you know, I'm a lawyer, and so I went to law school, you know, I'm not getting a law degree by, you know, sitting around and observing law books. I gotta open them up and read them, you know, and memorize it, you know, and study and write. But I remember saying that to Joel, and then I said, well, I'm still gonna stick with it, because the guy is telling me to just keep observing, and then sure enough, well, and then I met you and you used that word pixelate, and I thought, that's what's happening. They're pixelated. It's not suddenly like poof. It's not like they're just gone, but they're not as solid, right?
Yeah.
Like that,
Yeah.
those things aren't as solid in you. They're more.
Yeah, so let me rephrase one thing about love, because you mentioned the word was a little different, right, for each person. But honestly, now that you guys are all talking, I'm thinking appreciation, because when I recognized that it's the mistakes that I'm making. So to your question, right, how does that present yourself when you mess up and you're like, oh, I made a mistake. Yeah, well, as soon as you can acknowledge that I made a mistake and it's not the end of the world, you immediately see that it works for the good. That mistake actually is working for me to see both sides of the coin that you're talking about. You're supposed to make some mistakes so that you see the direction you could go in. Wow, nice. I enjoyed that kind of mess up I just did 2 minutes ago. Now I don't have to beat myself up about what an asshole I think my coworker is. Now I can see that I'm also an asshole sometimes, and that's okay. Like I went through that with coworkers like Teresa too, so you can probably understand, because honestly, my working life was a mess at one point. But
Your coworkers know more of an ass than you are.
yeah, right. But you see both sides and you appreciate it. It's working for the good.
So Susan and Beverly, what do you guys think? Putting you on the spot.
I'll say, I have an example, what you were asking about, Barbara.
Oh, great.
I was, walking down the street with a friend, and this was, a couple months ago, around the time, I don't know if my sister had passed yet, but there was a lot of very difficult time between me and my family. And I was walking with a friend, and she asked me where things stood. And so I was in this very negative place. As soon as I started talking about my family, the next thing I knew, I was face down on the ground in front of Penn Station. And I hurt my ribs. And I hurt my ribs for the third time in like a 6-month period. So, so I looked it up. What does that mean? Rib pain. And the ribs represent family.
Oh, wow.
So once I'm
Lucky, I did stuff like that.
once I put that all together,
Yeah.
and I actually get to a point of relief. You know, I mean, it's horrible to have to look at my behavior. And I can accept, like, it was a really difficult time for me. But and I have these like ridiculous standards for myself. So there's a lot of pain involved in that. But once I got the whole picture about what was going on, the ribs were healed. It was like I didn't need that injury anymore.
That's wonderful.
Interesting.
Beverly, some thoughts or, you want to talk or ask her?
Well, what I was thinking is that, I'm finding that I'm enjoying being a bitch. And it's only in my mind, I don't act on it. But I'm getting a kick out of it, and I'm glad that it's not bad. That's what I was thinking. I was like, oh, I shouldn't be thinking that. Oh, but it's funny. And like, I'm like, whenever somebody gets in the elevator, I always play a game with myself to see if I can ride in the elevator by myself without anybody else. push the button without somebody coming. And I know it's stupid.
That's awesome.
But it's just, every morning when I'm going to work, I play this game with myself to see if can I be in this elevator by myself without anybody else? It's the button really fast. So that's what I was just thinking about, my silly games.
Yeah. Joel and Juan, they haven't spoken.
Go ahead, Juan.
Joel?
Juan?
You can
No,
go,
Joel.
you keep going around if you want, if anybody wants to share.
Joel read that lecture about 20 times. So I'm
Yes.
sure you have a lot to say, and so do you, Juan. Let's go. You go
Oh.
first, and then Joel.
Okay, all right, so no one else?
And
wanna
then,
go?
no, and then Julie.
Come on.
You can do
Uh,
it.
All right, well, I want to try to make a point here, by reading.
Show them.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah.
I will make all the points.
Yeah, let me show up.
I will make all those points, too many of them.
Go through the paper yet?
My homework in law school didn't even.
Oh, yeah? All right, yeah, so by reading, I want to read here on page 4. On the second, middle of the first paragraph, actually. And then I will jump down to the last paragraph, the middle of it, the last one. Yeah, and just to try to make a point here, that what impacted me, this lecture is very powerful, I think, in general, because talk about, to me, something that happens to me a lot, in my life. These pretenses, this falsehood, and this mask or superimposed consciousness, a consciousness that the guy explains, to cover up the lower self, that negative aspect of me that I did not want to face, that I did not want to accept. So I superimpose those perfections, so to speak, that I thought was where I needed to be, where I wanted to be. So that's in relation to that, I'm gonna read here and then I'll try to make the point. The guy says here in the middle of the paragraph, the first one, in the last analysis, all unhappiness and strife is the result of ignorance and misunderstanding. Every inner problem you uncover is always a distortion of higher reality. Now, that's very powerful way to me. And then he goes on to explain in the middle of the last paragraph, where he says, the misunderstanding comes from the idea that you, of all people, really should have already completely overcome the lower self, and no such childish, preposterous selfishness and self-concern should have a place in you. Thus, you start an elaborate system of self-deceptions, pretense, which brings you into vicious circles and inner conflicts, destroying your unhappiness and self-respect. To me, that's very, very powerful. And the way I understand this is, it's all about, in the end, the way I understand it, connecting with that reality, connecting with the reality of the higher self. And, find ways, however it works for each individual, to overcome those layers that are covering, or lower self is called, right, in this lecture, that are covering their higher self, that reality, that truth, right? And by so doing, we eliminate the ignorance, because really the ignorance and the misunderstanding comes from thinking that we are where we are not supposed to be, that where we are is not where we are supposed to be. And as you all have been talking about, where you are, yes, that is where you are supposed to be. Like she said, she enjoys, negative traits or whatever it is that she's doing. That's what you are, okay? The key is acceptance, accepting that, okay, I'm not where this perfect person, this, great guy that I want to be, and this divine being that I know essentially I am. I'm not there yet. By accepting that reality where I am right now, with all my imperfection, with all my defects, and with all my weaknesses, and really embracing that and accepting it. And then by so doing, as you were saying, just even by observing, just by simply observing these negative traits, this negative aspect of ourselves, when they come to the surface of our awareness, just by observing them and focusing your awareness right on it, you start to, percolate or dissipate or however word we use.
Pixelate.
Pixelate, right? Pixelate, whatever. It starts to dissipate. I use dissipate because to me, it just starts to like a smog, starts to go away
Yeah.
slowly, smooth. Like you said, it's not a certain thing. It's happening slowly. And like I've said before, I observe that even in my physical, even in the physical, at a physical level, I practice that, whenever I hear, like if I hit myself on my knee, I right away, instead of shrinking, because this is the first bodily reaction to it, you shrink, you go into this state of like shrinking from the pain, right? But if instead you become aware and just focus your attention on the pain that you are feeling, and just on that specific area where you are feeling that pain, I tell you, right away, it starts to go away. And I practice this, this is realistic. Like I was saying, when I'm running, because I run, at least twice a week, once or twice a week. And if my knees start to hurt, instead of like, going like this with the pain, I just mentally, I start focusing my awareness in that area, and the pain starts to go away. Same thing when I take cold shower. Instead of like going crazy like this, I just observe my body feeling what it's feeling. And, it dissipates. The pain and the discomfort goes away. And this happens physically, psychologically, emotionally. That, I experiment that, and it works with me. So that's the point that I wanted to make, that really, to me, in the end, it just connecting with that reality, with connecting with the truth of what is in the present moment, and to do that, I think is one very, very, very important obstacles that we have, because if we realize we one of the things that distract us the most from this focus, from this concentration, present concentration, from being in the moment, is those background thoughts that the guy talks about at a different lecture. All these little thoughts that comes in like pieces, distracting you from the concentration of the moment, from being present in the moment, in what is. And these little background thoughts, or the chatterbox, or however name is given, it totally distracts you. So what I try to do is just observe those little pieces of thoughts that come to constantly to distract you from being in that present moment, and focusing your awareness in the reality of what is. Anyway, I can go on with this, so I just wanted to share that, but it's all about that, really, to being able to connect with that reality, and accept things. The key is accepting what is, and going through that, emotionally or physically, or whatever it is, But, yeah,
Thank you very much, Juan.
Of course, thank you.
Patricia, do you have any thoughts that you want to share?
Yeah, I was learning about myself as you all were talking, and I sometimes find my lower self showing up, acting out, like I start to be a little irritated. I start to react, to be even a bit provoking to whoever is close to me, and there's of course the side that starts to say, you don't have to be like that, like judging a little bit, but there's a whole dynamics of all these selves, because I was just finding out that it had to do, very often it has to do with me me disregarding my own needs, and the lower self comes to somehow calling my attention to that. And then I see that it's a less conscious way of my superimposed consciousness, which is keep on doing what you're doing, Trisha, just eat your piece and shut up, it's not so clear, but it's the superimposed consciousness telling me to oversee my needs and disregard my needs, and the lower self coming in and complaining about it. So it's just the dynamics that I was finding out here, that it's richer than only this. Sometimes they hate each other, sometimes they
Work together?
reveal each other somehow.
Yeah, that's a valuable recognition.
Yeah.
Gracie, what do you think?
Well, I already spoke, but I'd like to hear what Joel.
And Barbara, Joel is trying to not speak, he's saving the best for
He read
last.
this lecture 20 times. You must have some observation.
It's all been said.
Not by you.
Well, one thing, I mean, this may seem a little wacky, but I have trouble hearing, and I'm very grateful to everyone here for speaking out, not only expressing what they're saying from their hearts and, their integrity, but speaking in a way that I hear you really loud and clear, and I really appreciate that. So I just wanted to mention that.
You're saying we're really loud.
Except you didn't speak it.
Except you.
We were getting loudness. Loud now.
But the thing I wanted to share from, my, I guess my observation or my life is siblings. We're the sibling gals right here. I have an older I have an older sister and a younger brother, and there's a wedding in family, a family wedding to go to in New Hampshire.
Oh, boy.
And I was the only one, I felt like, oh, I really want to go to this. And I looked, I didn't even do much research, but I said, I don't want to go by myself. Bill passed, I don't, I contacted my brother. Nah, I can't afford it. I can't go. I don't want to go. And I asked my sister, do you have any thoughts? And she's, she's got this new boyfriend, anyway. And then I'm thinking, I'm just not going to go. I don't want to rent a car. I don't like driving. So then all of a sudden my sister calls me up and says, I want to go with you. Let's go. So we made all these elaborate plans. She's in Florida, we're flying. We're going to meet in Newark. We're taking a little plane up to, anyway, you don't need to know all these details. And it was like, we got the hotel, and it took, we sort of, we made a phone date to, go over the plans. And this was excruciating for me, because my sister's she'll keep me on the phone while she's talking and deciding, and I had already done all the research, but I gathered my patience. I guess what I'm trying to say is that, and I hung in there, and we did it, we made the plan. And then over the weekend, I got a text from my brother saying, I want to come with you. He didn't know I'd made a plan with my sister. And I was busy. I was out, and I texted him back and I said, look, I made plans with Lisa. This is my flight, and we have a hotel room. So he got on the same flight. So that's not the end of the story. So this was, and I'm thinking, oh my God, do I know how to manifest,
How you say about what?
I am powerful.
You said you did nothing.
So, but then, I'm apparently, I just have to backtrack. My family has a big history of bad mouthing everybody else. In other words, my sister, growing up, my sister was the baddie, the bad one. And then my brother talks to me about my sister being bad. My sister talks to me about my brother being bad, and all this criticism. And I think that they weren't speaking to each other.
Oh.
Anyway,
Watkins.
I get, and I've been really busy. I've had a lot of other things to do, but I was happy that this was going to happen in August. So then I get a call from my sister. She goes, I don't want James staying in the room with us. And I said, because we thought, oh, this is going to be a real sisterly kind of thing to do. And I'm like, and she goes, I'm going to get another room. And I'm thinking, well, I'd rather be with you than James. And so
we'll kick him out.
what? No, so it was just the patience I had being able to, like, my sister's like, I'm just gonna get another room and I'm gonna tell, and then I said, I'd rather be with you. Why don't we just tell him to get his own room? And it was like her willfulness, and I said, like, I think we ought to have maybe, I said, why don't we just have a Zoom with the three of us together and talk it over and, you know, share what our thoughts are, what we want to do. She goes, I'm not doing that. You know, like, I don't want to involve him, you know. So anyway,
So typical family.
yeah, we took a break and she and I came to a solution that she would write a text, a 3-way text. So the bottom of the story is, you know, that she sent the text like, you know, we want to, you know, I spoke to Barbara, she wants to stick with our original plan, you know, get your own room. And I said, that's great, you know, and I, you know, and she put the name of the hotel and I put a telephone number. My brother was fine with it. He was so happy, you know, but it was just her willfulness, like, I'm gonna do this. So I guess what I'm trying to get at with, you know, this story is I have like a lot of judgments, but I still had them, but I was able to be in communication about, like, let's find another way. Let's, you know, let's work through it, you know, so that, I think that sort of sums it up. I think that also in relation to this lecture, in terms of my lower self as having, you know, like a lot of judgments and, you know, becoming more and more aware of them, writing them down all the time. And, you know, sort of accepting them and maybe being more like taking to heart the part of the lecture that says, and I don't even know if they're lower self, maybe they are, but taking to heart the part of the lecture that talks about the repression as repressing things that might be creative.
Yes.
Yeah. And that I think that that's what I'm trying to identify. I think that's
a very good example.
I think this is what's happening with me. And I'm looking forward to August. The next, I think that the next meeting will be afterwards. So we'll be able to report. I will be able to report.
Yeah.
The August meeting, I mean, will be after.
After the wedding.
And I'm thinking of that wise saying, patience is a virtue.
Yeah.
Because it really is. When you say
Oh.
patience, when you said patience,
Yeah.
that means you're willing to not just act off of a wild impulse. You were willing to be with it, even though you've got all these judgments going on. And judgments, the divine aspect is discernment.
Yeah,
Mm.
right, yeah.
And you did, and you're the perfect example of what you're saying,
Exactly.
of being with both and then being in choice, being in choice. That's freedom. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
And just by the way, that little joke you said about I'm one hell of a manifester, that's exactly what's happening though, without ego aggrandizement or anything, is because of that patience, because of that willingness to connect. The universe is literally there, right? With actually, you're right there with you, supporting you with new challenges. And that could be your brother coming into it. It could have been anything. And maybe it'll grow even further. Who knows? We'll see what happens in August, but that's wonderful. That's wonderful. You're getting what you're looking for. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Good job. And you're inviting your sister into seeing it because you're demonstrating something that she can go, wow. She's kind of different right now, whereas she's open to that now suddenly. What the heck is that?
Well, she's like, what, 30 years of Pathwork, 40 years?
Yeah, right.
How long? It's been a long time.
Yeah, like 40, but I have to say that it hasn't been as intense as now. You know, I mean, I think that I think that when I did the Pathwork earlier, it was only for maybe about 3 or 4 years that I was like really involved, and I hadn't really done like wasn't in a training group or anything like that, but it did have a huge impact on my outlook towards life. Even, I mean, I've always been a sort of like self-observer in a way, but it had like a huge impact. And it's just the need, you know, just the last couple years, last 2 years, I guess, to you know, dive back in and, you know, bring it more into my life. And I guess it's because I'm in a big transition and feel like, yeah, I mean, I feel like I had a life and a chapter, and now I'm ready for another chapter. And I'm looking to this Pathwork as a way to go on. I don't, you know,
Thank you.
so.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I'm very glad you're doing it with us.
Thank
Me
you.
too.
Yeah, me
Thank
too.
you.
Helps all of us,
Yeah.
sharing.
Thank you for sharing.
Yes, thank you.
Really, that was awesome. That was
Thank
awesome.
you.
I think we can all relate, or a lot of us can relate to
Yeah,
that.
well, we were
story.
saying the sibling,
Yeah. the
I
siblings
just,
especially.
well, springboard off of that. I have 8 brothers and sisters. And mine.
Yeah, close. I have
Yeah, yeah.
Eight too? Oh my.
You have 8 too?
Who else does?
And,
Eight.
Eight here.
yeah,
Whoa.
How
yeah.
many do you have? 3. Brother, so 4 altogether.
Believe me, it's.
I
Yeah.
have 3.
Yeah,
All right, so go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say that I've had a lot of issues with my siblings in the last few years, and I thought we were one big happy family, and then all of a sudden, it's almost like you were saying when you start something.
Yeah.
It's like, oh my God, this is bad, this, you know, like, you notice all these things that it's really not that great.
You met the green girl.
Yeah, I met the green girl, that was part of it,
Yeah.
and anyway, now I have a helper that I work with once a month just to work on primarily on my sibling things. And I'm changing, and I always was like so convinced that they needed to change. And now I'm changing, and I'm really, you know, it's like not beating myself up. The other thing that the thought that keeps coming into my mind as people were speaking was you know, Eckhart Tolle talks about the identification with thoughts. So like if you think of the lower self of being you know, a bunch of judgments and thoughts or whatever, if you think you are that, you know, then that piece of you is going to die. That's, you know, the end of your life. Where if you can be the observer and pull yourself out from that, that's not who you are. That's just one of the layers on the onion to get to the, you know, the core in the middle. It's much easier to work on your lower self when you do have that space that Kevin was talking about, compassion or whatever. So that's just something that I work with all the time, because I'll find myself like being in it and going, wait a minute, this is not who I am, you know.
Yeah.
The consciousness comes through to point out, you know, that this is not who I am, but this is something that says, that's giving me a hint of where I need to work to go deeper. So, and the whole thing is really just going deeper, you know, it's really the shallow layers that we're so used to. That's the superimposed conscience that comes from society or parents or whatever. And I know I feel like what Teresa was saying is I have a very similar experience, that my mother was very strong, you know, this is the right way, this is what we do, and you know, right from wrong. And but it even like I just had something recently happen with my siblings where that's where I was saying the action that you take may be exactly the same, but if you're coming from not your true self, it doesn't feel right.
Right.
So that's something that's been happening where I'm just like, wait a minute, I know this is the right action, but I'm so uncomfortable with it.
Marion always says it's your intention.
Yeah,
You always say it's the intention.
What's the
intention
Where you're
behind
coming
it.
from, yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah, I'm glad to be working on relationship with my siblings, because I do want to have a healthy relationship with them, and each one is a different relationship, but then we have the group dynamic as well. So I feel like that's, you know, my purpose coming to earth. You know, they say everybody has, mine is like being able to be true to myself in a group setting and not get caught up in whatever's happening on the outside, to just like really be true to myself So, because I have this big family, and then now I have my hiking group, and then I have my Pathwork group from Virginia, now I have you guys. Like, I keep creating these groups, these
Yeah.
groups to work through that purpose of being able to be true to myself when I'm in the group and not necessarily agree with everybody,
Yeah.
but then that's okay.
Yeah.
And that's what I
Right.
struggle with my siblings, because they can be critical and say, well, you're wrong, we're not, it turns into this fight, and I'm just like, that's not, I'm just saying, I think differently, I don't know. So trying to find that place to be true to myself, and without creating, unnecessary conflict or, lack of love or whatever, separation,
Yeah.
like, I don't want separation, but sometimes you have, that can be the reality of something you have to accept too, so there's a lot to it, but this,
It's something I noticed, so thank you for sharing what you shared, because I think I can kind of walk with you on that, and that is that I've noticed, did a lot of observing all these decades and everything, but the observing now is that when I feel mean and nasty inside, I call her mean, nasty Mary, and she's always with me here,
Yeah.
somewhere, is that I have given my power over to the other person. And what I think is their view of me, and I feel belligerent and nasty and mean, I don't act it out. I do not act it out. But I thought, oh, I need to catch the point where I've given my power to them.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, so I need to catch that. And that takes me into a relationship with my God self, so I can report it to God. Oh, I did it again. I gave my power over to the person at the supermarket or something, or given my power over to my friend. And I feel a little bit judgmental toward them. Oh, I gave my power to them. So
so
that's kind
that
of,
brings up another point that I noticed when people were talking, is that just the idea of naming it, like you were saying, mean Marion or lower self or whatever. If you like, I don't like naming it in a way because it concretizes, it makes it solid where it might not be. But if you name it, then you're not it. It's
yeah.
Yeah.
separate from who you are, like, and then you can say,
Yes.
that gives you the space to say,
Mhm.
okay, that's my lower self, it's not really my, it's,
It's different
sort
than
of
label.
separate.
It's different than labeling.
yeah, yeah.
It's naming it, reporting in what your
Yeah.
observation is. And when I'm more identified with my human stuff, I remember this one spiritual teacher said, when you're in more human identified, you better have a God outside of yourself. Even though I am God in here, you
Yeah.
better have that God that you talk to if I'm more identified with being human,
Yeah.
flawed human being, yeah.
Just one brief comment, Alan. So of all the lectures that, at least that I can recall, which is not that many, but because you get so into whichever one we're on at the moment, there were so many times where this lecture talked about the fact that the reason we're doing the work is to connect with our unified self. That the reason that we're talking about the superconscious, that we're talking about the lower self, is to identify the blockages, the knots that we're not aware of, and that then we can have this magnificent life. I didn't really, I think the satisfactory, I'm not sure that that's really the word that we understand it to be, that was being expressed. And maybe that's because, our undeveloped self thinks of peace and happiness as no demands, no problems. But actually, we know, and especially from doing the pathwork, that the problems, the difficulties, the conflicts are the opportunities to lead us to greater peace, to greater connection, and greater identification with our God self, with our soul, which is our essence.
Amen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, he, because when he's been reading it, he probably read it 20 times, I'm not exaggerating. And he would observe something, and he would then obviously talk to me. Oh, it was so interesting, and you said this earlier, it's like going through the obstructions the treasure is behind all those obstructions, and that's why you keep going. It's like, okay, I've got to move. I kind of think it's like almost like a, you're clearing a path in the forest, because at the end there's the pot of gold, and so you've got to move the sticks, you've got to move the debris, move the rocks. If you don't, you're not getting to that pot of gold, which is our God self, which is what's inside. And then the point that you made, which is really it's a scientific point, which is energy. Every single obstruction is just a divine, because it's energy. So it's just, so if you, it's distorted at that point. So it comes out kind of negative, like you made it something about being bossy, but also being, what was the, I forget, you just said it. It was exact discernment, those, so if you realize that all the negativity that you're working so hard to get through, that energy can be freed up to then be expressed in the positive way. It's because it's just energy.
I would just say, look at the lecture for children, or I think it's called the Christmas lecture,
Oh, yeah.
or the lecture towards the children, or something
Yeah.
like that. That talks all about that one energy and all of its possible manifestations and the negative. Because all these kids were mentioning, like,
Yeah.
hey, what about this? What about this? I hate my
Yeah,
parents,
yeah,
or whatever, like, oh,
right.
that's because you want to be independent, like there was
Yes.
all a positive
Yes,
spin to it. It was
yes.
amazing, that
Yeah,
lecture.
no,
It's
it
just
is, that is.
life-changing, that lecture.
It is, maybe we should do that one next. That is, because it does talk about that.
It's amazing.
Because I was
I
thinking
think
about
it
your
is a Christmas
patience.
lecture.
Patience, you were willing to stay with it, stay with
Yeah.
it, stay with
Yeah.
it. And the uncomfortableness, the hope, all that, you're willing to stay with it, yeah.
Which was exactly what Juan was saying about just being with the feeling, being with
Yeah.
whatever is. And that's a major stumbling block, right? We don't want to feel pain.
Yeah.
Pain is symbolizing death.
Yeah.
But if we just let ourselves feel it as being in the observer self, right? Maybe it's, I stay with my breath, right? So if I'm uncomfortable, I just stay with my breath and then just allow myself to feel whatever I'm feeling. And then it passes. There's no feeling that's going to destroy us. But that's what we're afraid of.
The one thing that you did for me this period, though, that I had not connected this thought, was that I knew that the mere observation would cause my faults and blockages to dissipate, but I just was sort of thinking, well, I want to do that because I'm being a good girl, that's what I should. I didn't realize until this lecture what he said, because that's what doing that. The reason it's not just you're a good girl, it's because once you do that, that pot of gold, which is your divine self, that's what's waiting for you. So that's why we're crawling on our hands and knees, trying so hard to follow this path that's so difficult for all of us, because your nose is to the, in the smelly mud. But it's like, if you know that when you finally get through it, you're going to reach.
You're
I love the
lucky man,
lecture
Joel.
start with that.
Just remember that.
I never
You do.
realized
That
that.
was
Just
beautiful. Just- You're a lucky man.
Discussion of the structure of the.
That was beautiful. Thank you for.
We all start
For all the men in the world, that was just beautiful.
Well, I never realized that.
Oh, yeah.
I never realized.
He says it wasn't true, but I'll take it. I think you just enjoyed it.
Okay.
We should probably start our.
Yes.
So that's.
Okay, I need
Yes.
to run
He's
before the
gotta go.
meditation, although I will
Okay.
be in spirit, I promise.
Yeah,
I just need to
this is
get-
also
Oh,
probably
okay.
later.
Oh, yes.
Thank you so much.
We're gonna-
Take care.
everything is-
So good to see you.
Did anyone else want to say anything,
Maybe
Grace?
Grace? Love you all. Great, yeah, love this.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'm just gonna, just grab my.
Take care, Robert.
Yeah.
Great to have you,
It's wonderful to see everyone again.
Great to have you.
Take care. Nice to meet you.
Back home.
You got that, but you need that
Thank
in.
you. Thank you, everyone. Bye now.
Hold on,
Candle.
everybody.
I think Grace wanted to speak.
Oh, I think great one, great one. Let's hear from you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kevin.
Yes.
Say goodbye, Kevin. Teresa, say goodbye, Kevin. Too tight.
One training hour. You're doing.
Yeah, so what I would say is, I'll talk a little bit about the observer. So a long time ago, where I started off with the observer is when I get a negative thought, I would ask that thought, really, is that what you got? is that the best you can do? And what is that supposed to do for me? So I would ask these questions, and sometimes I would not ask question. I would just say, can you be gentle with me? And over time, these negativity tend to go away. They became softer.
Observing.
Yes, they became at first softer and softer. And eventually I got to this place where, fingers crossed, there's hardly any negative thoughts. I still get them, but then when it comes in, I said, interesting. And what am I supposed to do with that? So I come back to that questioning again, like, why are you giving me such a message? What am I supposed to do with it? But then I don't bother with it too much. I have this thing whereby I promise myself not to linger in negativity too much. I allow it, I accept it for what it is, because it's a message. It's my lower self saying something to me. So I don't push it away. I don't ignore it. I acknowledge it, but I leave it alone. And I also have this thing whereby I ask myself, is that coming from me? Or is that someone else's energy? Because I noticed that I'm extremely sensitive to other people's energy. And sometimes way before I knew this, I always thought that is my energy. But then when I became aware that it is a possibility that it could be other people's energy, I would ask myself, is that coming from me, or is that someone else's energy? And if it's someone else's energy, why is that coming through the way it's coming through? Like, what am I supposed to do with it?
How do you interact with it?
Yes, yes.
I'll give the message to go.
Go ahead.
But yeah, I also like what you mentioned earlier about the empathy and the compassion. When negative thought comes up, and sometimes they still do, but very rare. And if I entertain it, if someone made me mad and I felt like it was unjust and I entertain it, I start to have physical pain in my body. It can be anywhere. And generally, I don't get pain. Like, I'm very fortunate. I consider myself very blessed that I don't get physical pain. But when I entertain negative thoughts, just because I wanted to be right in that moment, or I felt like, that person was nasty. Why were they nasty to me? Like, I gave you no reason to be nasty. So, and when I entertain those negative thoughts, that's when I start having physical pain. So that was an indication for me to say, maybe I shouldn't go down that route. It's not for me. And I come back to ask myself, can you be more gentle with me? And every time I ask those questions, can you be more gentle? Can you be more patient with me? It turns things around. Eventually, the negativity tends to dissipate. They tend to fade away. And I know energy, everything is energy. Energy cannot be destroyed. It can only be transformed. But by being gentle with myself, or speaking gently to myself, asking myself to be more gentle, they tend to soften. And I want to say something about what you mentioned earlier about, and a little bit about intention. So that what you mentioned about manifesting, that could have easily gone wrong. I'll let you have what you have, but I'm just saying, when our intention is, you know what, I like my brother. I don't have a brother, by the way. I have strangers that I've turned into brothers, by the way. But let's say I had a brother and I would entertain the thought that, I want him to go have his own room. And if that thought had some kind of underlying harshness, it could have turned out in a way whereby your brother may not be happy with the idea of getting his own room. But when we want something to happen and we're gentle with the thought, like we don't have any animosity or hatred toward it.
Negative intention.
Yes, it turns around, but then it turns around based on that kind of energy we infused into the thought. Yeah, I also have this rule for myself.
I was just gonna say that the part of it that I didn't express in the story was my sister had a lot of negative intention about my brother not sharing the room. And so my hanging in there with her to allow and, you know, be able to communicate with the three of us. It sort of changed the energy, but you're so right about that was the thing. If she just went ahead and got that room herself and said, you know, it would have been like a bad, you know.
Yeah.
It's almost
Not
like you
good.
became the observer of.
Yeah, so you were very sensitive to that.
So yeah,
Yeah.
people pick up on, let's say for instance, I'm sitting here with you. You don't know me, I don't know you. We're meeting for the first time. But let's say for instance, I were to have these thoughts about you. Let's say I might say things like in my mind, oh, why you talk too much? Or why are you talking only about family issues? And you know, if I were to get annoyed and go on this tangent of being non-compassionate toward what you're saying, like why, or I could have easily said, okay, why is Teresa talking about hate so much, for instance? Yeah. There, in my opinion, my understanding is whether I'm coming from the lower self, there is, we always have these beings around us. Well, first of all, we were born with two guardian angels that are with us from start to end, and then throughout our lives we always have this horseshoe of angels or beings that are assigned to us. Some of them come in and out, and they have a way of communicating with the beings around other people. We're not mind readable. Some of us are mind readers, but even when we're not mind readers, you know, this is how you feel other people's vibe. So I would say, be careful what you think about yourself, about other people, and yeah, always be kind. You just never know what people are going through, and even when you don't like what someone is doing, don't entertain the thought of, oh, I don't like this, or I hate this. I have this rule for myself: for certain words, or because it starts with words for me, and then it becomes, oh, there's an energy attached to that word. So I don't use words like hate, or any kind of hard word. Right now, there's not much comes to mind except for hate, because we talked a little bit about that. Yeah, right now my mind cannot think of it. Think of any, which is a good thing. But yeah, anything that has like these lower vibration, I tend to shy away from it. And the more we practice it over time, it becomes, we find ourselves getting to a better place in life. So yeah.
Amen.
Life so.
Thank you. Thank you, Grace.
Yeah.
All right, my friends, we're going to have our meditation. We're going to have a 15-minute meditation.
Oh, I think yeah, there you go.
There we go. And I'll read a short part of the last paragraph of the lecture. Now let's meditate on all the recognitions we've made and the beautiful energy that we share for our path of self-confrontation. Accept fully the primitive, selfish, destructive child in order to make it grow up. The only climate in which it can do so is in the full knowledge of all its manifestations. How you accept it without losing a sense of proportion about its badness determines the degree to which you are able to perceive, experience, and accept the highest faculties within yourself. You can only lose your sense of guilt about the former if and when you learn to look at the impulses coming from it and realize that although this undesirable side exists, you need not act accordingly. At least you do not deceive yourself about your own state of development, and you evaluate all its dictates without acting them out. Then you will have a chance to win in this tragic battle. You will liberate yourself from the false conscience and therefore become capable of hearing the voice of your real conscience.
Did you set the timer?
Oh,
You
I
want
will.
me to?
Could you do that,
Yeah.
Tracy?
15 minutes,
Yeah, shall we do 10 minutes?
whatever you want.
15 minutes.
Up to
All
you.
right, all right.
Is everybody okay with 15? Yes, or do we need to do 10?
15 is fine with me, also.
Blessed is this hour.